Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are in the world watching this. I'm Tigress Osborn, aka Eye of the Tigress, and I'm so honored to be part of the Fat Community Conference this year for the first year, and I hope to see you in many more spaces in the year to come. Today I'm going to talk about fat activism, how it started, how it's going. First, here's what we're going to cover today: what fat activism is, four historic fat activism moments, how those moments connect to today, and a little bit about the importance of intersectionality in today's fat activist movement. I always like to start with a bit of autobiography because I think it's important for audiences to know who they're engaging with and where my privileges or biases might lie. So, first, um, I am a fat, Black, mixed race, um, American, cisgender, college educated, from a working class background, middle aged woman. And any of those things might impact the way I see the world, certainly do impact the way I see the world. Um, I am also the owner and founder of Full Figure Entertainment, which was a nightclub event for plus size folks, a really POC centered nightclub event for plus size folks in the San Francisco and Oakland area from 2008 until about 2017. And I am also the co-founder of the Phoenix Fat Force, which is a small intersectional fat positive organization here where I am based now in Arizona, which I co founded with Red Streak Girl. And I am also the chair of the board of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which we'll talk about a little bit in this presentation. Um, and then online, I'm Eye of the Tigress. You can follow me on social media if you want to see what my online persona is like. So, what is fat activism? Let's dive right in. There are a lot of ways to define fat activism, and I love definitions that are not super formal. So instead of going to dictionary.com or one such place, I started with Urban Dictionary, which defines fat activism as a movement based around the idea that people can be healthy and beautiful at any size. And they point out that the movement is generally accepted as having been started in 1969 with the founding of NAFA by Bill Fabry. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. Then I went to Wikipedia, my next favorite a source for general information. Please fact check the things that you find on Urban Dictionary and Wikipedia. But I actually really like Wikipedia's definition of fat activism. It says the fat activist movement is a social movement seeking to change anti fat bias in social attitudes by raising awareness among the general public about the obstacles faced by fat people. Areas of contention include aesthetic, legal, and medical approaches to people whose bodies are fatter than the social norm. I really like this definition. I'm a little bit hesitant with their reliance on the word social. I probably would have said socio-political because, as you can see from my definition of fat activism to me is a labor in support of the politicized stance that fat people deserve the same rights and respect as everyone else, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. But there has to be some politic behind it. So, what about body positivity? How does the body positivity movement fit in here? And is fat activism body positivity? Well, yes and no. The fat activism movement has been around long enough that we're really in the third wave of this movement, possibly even the beginning of the fourth wave. The rise of what we call body positivity begins during fat activism's second wave and really becomes popular during the third wave of fat activism in the early 2000s going forward. Um, a lot of the beliefs and principles about body positivity, loving yourself, accepting your so called flaws, um, rebelling against mainstream beauty standards, these things descend directly from messages of early fat activism, especially fat feminists. And a lot of what we think of as body positivity was championed by Black women and femmes, other people of color, queer folks, disabled folks. There is no body positivity movement without fat activism. And there is no fat body positivity movement without fat people's influence, whether they identified themselves as activists or not. But body positivity, as we talk about it today, the hashtag BOPO, body positivity that we talk about now, has gone pretty mainstream. Visibly fat people, especially Black and brown and queer and disabled ones who pioneered today's body positivity, particularly in spaces like Tumblr and Instagram and social media, those people are too often left out of today's narrative. And body positivity can tend toward the personal, when fat activism, even the most mainstream fat activism, has more politic associated with it from its early days. The fight for fat rights can be seen as feeling good about our bodies, but it has to be about access and equity. And body positivity doesn't always concern itself with those issues. So before we get into some history, let's be clear about one thing. There have been fat ass, badass people living our best lives since long before the events that I'm going to tell you about now. And there were fat people of all genders living unapologetically and shining in every area of life, as much as they were able to in their historical periods, and pushing the boundaries of that in their historical periods. And shout out to historical fat people on Instagram, which is a fantastic account that showcases some of those folks. It is absolutely necessary to understand that the history we're about to cover is the documented, organized fat activist movement. And fat people, and especially fat Black women and femmes, have always been doing groundbreaking work in other social justice movements. And their influence on the culture cannot be emphasized enough. So as we look at early fat activism, I want you to think about the people you don't see here. One of the things I'm trying to do in my work these days is piece together more of those stories. Today's story is actually about some of the people who we know were there. I always want people to engage in activism in a way that cares about where we came from as activists. But the story of where we came from is bigger than what is in official archives. So we're going to talk about some of the archival information, the historically documented information, because a lot of folks in the movement don't know these pieces. But I also want you to be thinking about who's not represented in these pieces and what else they were doing instead and why they were not represented. So for historic fat activist moments, we're going back to the late 1960s, the Vietnam War era, the Summer of Love, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the era of Stonewall and the Alcatraz occupation. And in the midst of these major cultural events, we see the beginnings of the fat activist movement as we know it today. The first of these historic moments is the 1967 Fat-In at Central Park in New York City. This event was called for by a radio station DJ named Steve Post, and some historical understanding of this event, it wasn't really clear whether it was a little bit jokey, a little bit of a publicity stunt, or whether it was sort of a sincere activist kind of move. He was inspired by other ins of the times, sit-ins, love-ins, be-ins, and later we come to see that he really was inspired to do this sincerely. It's debatable what his life was like after this event in terms of his relationship to his fat body, but we know that 500 people showed up in New York's Central Park. And here's what Mr. Post had to say to the New York Times about that. He said, "The advertising campaigns have attempted to make us feel guilty about our size. People should be proud of being fat. We want to show we feel happy, not guilty. That's why we're here." The next year, in the Saturday Evening Post, a writer named Lou Lauterbach published an editorial called "More People Should Be Fat." Now, you have to remember the Saturday Evening Post is one of the most popular publications of its time, so this is a big deal. And in his piece, he argued that fat people and aspiring thin people to be as he called himself and his wife Anne refugees from the insanity of diet culture, and he was encouraging other people to be the same, to get off the hamster wheel of dieting and diet obsession and obsession with thinness, and live in their bodies at whatever their body's natural state was. um, Now, that article inspired a young engineer in New York named Bill Fabry, who had been thinking a lot about the treatment that he saw his fat wife enduring in the world and what he should be doing as an ally, um, to support this woman he loved. Um, Bill copied Lou Lauterbach's article and handed it out to friends. And then he reached out to Lou and asked, could you help me team up to start an organization to help fat people? And they had their first meeting in the summer of 1969. And the small group of folks who met with them designated Bill the chair and founder. The name at the time was the National Association to Aid Fat Americans, and it was later changed to the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which is how we know NAFA today. NAFA is currently the longest running fat rights organization in the world, and Bill continues to be engaged in fat activism today, well into his 70s. Now, there were women who were involved in NAFA who were also ardent feminists, some of them quite radical feminists, and they began to see that NAFA was too mainstream for their taste. So they started creating their own groups. The most notable of these groups, in part because of the publication we're about to talk about, is the Fat Underground. The Fat Underground published the 1973 Fat Liberation Manifesto. It declared solidarity with other liberation movements. It insisted on dismantling the reducing industries, otherwise known as diet companies, and it demanded full rights and liberty as promised by the US Constitution. So, where does it go from there? What does any of that have to do with fat activism today? Those four key events in the late 1960s and the early 70s, 50 or more years ago, what does that have to do with now? Well, the events that I just highlighted for you echo through the next 50 years of fat activism, all the way into today and the Fat Community Conference we are all here for. You will hear some of these themes repeated as you participate in other aspects of this conference. Lou Lauterbach went on to write Fat Power, which is regarded as the first fat activist book. We're going to talk about some other important books towards the end of the presentation. The Central Park Fat Inn never had a second edition, but events like Leah-Ho, the Let It All Hang Out protest, and dancing in the street moment in San Francisco, the London Fat Olympics, the Fat Flash Mob, just to name a few events. Events like that have demonstrated fat people's willingness to put our bodies out in public in the name of fat pride. The language of the Fat Manifesto, the Fat Liberation Manifesto, and the work of the Fat Underground and the other feminist organizations of that time influences everything from fat studies as an academic discipline to the memes that you see on social media today. NAFA celebrated our golden anniversary in 2019. And still, the organization still works towards equality at every size. Across many generations, for many people in the US and Canada, and for some people elsewhere in the international community, NAFA conventions were the first places where they experienced the fat fashion shows, the fat pool parties, the fat dance parties that are now relatively common in many places in the world, especially, again, in the US and Canada. In the wake of NAFA and the Fat Underground and the other fat feminist organizations of the 70s and 80s, there are now fat rights and fat liberation organizations all over the globe. Here in the US, which is where I'm based, besides NAFA, I'm going to mention a few of the other organizations that I've worked with and partnered with. And please know this is not an exhaustive list of everyone, right? But some folks that whose work I find valuable and important: Fat Women of Color, Fat Rose, No Lose, the Nobody is Disposable Coalition, Flair Project for Legal Education, the Council on Weight and Size Discrimination, which was founded by Bill Fabry when he left the board of NAFA, so that he could continue the work of fat activism alongside many other important leaders. Fat visibility in the arts and entertainment and fashion still leaves a lot to be desired, but it is certainly better than it was 50 years ago. And individual activists and advocates are visible everywhere from the halls of education to the hashtags that you see on your favorite social media app. So, fat activism today um, is still rooted in some of the things we learned during that era. One of those things is the importance of intersectionality. The fat liberations. Well, maybe we didn't learn that in that era. Some fat activists did not learn that in that era, but it is essential to the modern era. When you look at the Fat Liberation Manifesto, the third point of it says this: we see our struggle as allied with the struggles of other oppressed groups against classism, racism, sexism, ageism, financial exploitation, imperialism, and the like. Now, but in the early movement, especially in NAFA, which is where many people encountered fat activism for the first time, um, it was not there was often a lack of intersectionality, a lack of awareness of exactly what the fat underground tried to say right then. Intersectionality describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. And specifically, it is about how these intersections impact individuals and communities in terms of dealing with systemic oppression. Um, we sometimes hear people who are new to this terminology sometimes hear intersectionality and think it means the way our lives all intersect because we are all fat, and it actually almost means the opposite of that. It's talking about the way that even though we are all fat, the intersections of our individual identities can impact the way we experience fatness and the way the world experiences our fatness. Now, there's a thing that people still say in fat activism, and I've been doing fat activism for over a dozen years, and I still come across this idea that because weight stigma and fat shaming are tolerated in our culture, which they are, while other kinds of isms are, frowned upon socially, that somehow means we've cured all the other social ills and all the other ways that people are plagued by oppression because of who they are. But if you think that we have cured all the other stuff, you have some glaring holes in your understanding of what the other stuff is. Anti-fatness is not the last acceptable prejudice. We live in a culture where lots of kinds of prejudice are actually still pretty acceptable. It's probably your privilege showing if you think that anti-fatness is the last kind of prejudice that people are enduring. Um, and you should dig into that if you're serious about fat activism. We can't repeat the mistakes of our fat grand elders, many of whom believed that in order for fat activism to be successful, it had to be concentrated only on the fat part. There were other people doing that other social justice stuff, and that was great. We want them to do that. We want other people to have rights and respect. But we're experts in the fat part, so we're just going to concentrate on the fat part. And that applies to all the fat people. But that doesn't apply to all the fat people because we're experiencing anti-fatness differently based on those intersectional identities that we have. Being in solidarity with other anti-oppression movements does not mean that we need to be in constant comparison in order to prove that weight stigma is bad. It is bad. There are serious and life-altering ways in which anti-fatness limits our lives. And there are serious and life-altering ways that a whole bunch of other oppressions very actively still alter many of our lives. And if we think we can eliminate anti-fatness, if we think we can achieve some utopia of fat acceptance, without eliminating racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and xenophobia and all the other things, if we think we can live happy, fat lives while those things are still going on, what do we imagine happens to the people who exist in those communities who are still fat? Um, unity strengthens fat activism, but it's not actually unity if it looks like white, heteronormative, able bodied, except, fat activist movement. If we truly have an intersectional understanding of fat activism or fat liberation, we know that removing barriers to fat people living our best lives does not free all fat people if there are still fat people who face other discrimination. So we really need to stop saying that, and we really need to call in, call out, sit them down, shut them down, whatever we need to do when we hear people in our community say that. Um, so here I'm going to tell you 3 things that you can do to make sure that we are listening to and uplifting and supporting the fat people who face double, triple, or more kinds of bias because they are fat and something else. Here, these are 3 ways. Please build your own list of more than 3, but these 3 are some good places to start. First of all, learn about colonialism and white supremacy and how anti-fatness work together to impact our perceptions of fat bodies, and really how anti-fatness is built out of those things. Next, work to uncover the people of color, the LGBTQIA people, the disabled people, the superfats, all of the people who have been left out of the fat activist history, or the history of body positivity. All of those folks who belong there, let's let's dig up whatever is covered up, and let's own the places where there really weren't some of those folks, because we weren't intersectional enough as a community to be welcoming. And then finally, commit to an intersectional approach to fighting anti-fatness. Own your own privilege, use it to the benefit of others, and really, really try to embody that belief that intersectionality has got to be at the forefront of our movement. I'm going to suggest a couple of books that you may want to take a look at that have been helpful to me and that will hopefully be helpful to you if you are a book lover. Shadow on a Tightrope is a collection of fat writings by women on fat oppression. It is sort of the Bible of fat feminism of the early 80s and beyond, and it's a great historical document. And much of it still reads as very true today. Fat Activism by Dr. Charlotte Cooper is a fantastic collection of some of the kinds of moments that I've talked to you about today, and also a lot of intersectional analysis, particularly about queer identities and about feminism. And then I want you to think about, when I said think about colonialism and think about white supremacy and how it has shaped our ideas about fat bodies, Dr. Sabrina String's book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, is going to give you a great foundation in understanding that. And then 2 that look at more contemporary issues in intersectional fat activism. 2 of my favorites, Dr. Joy Cox and Deshawn L. Harrison. This is Fat Girls in Black Bodies, and this is Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness. I am just a fangirl of all of these people. So, and I know you have a lot to learn from them, and there's a lot to be discussed about their work. I also know that we need to be thinking about fat activist history in ways other than books. And I encourage you to think about sharing with this fat community conference and the participants you meet other kinds of media that talk to us about the history of fat activism, the history of our movement, the intersectionality of our current movement. As Charlotte Cooper says, her book is often thought of as the sort of definitive book on fat history, and she would be on fat activist history, and she would be resistant to that because I think she would have said that there is not supposed to be a definitive book, that she's proud of her work, but there should be many books, and hers should just be one of them. So I recommend reading hers, and I also recommend that you do not stop there. And I encourage you to think about the ways that you can create other types of media that will help bring people into an understanding of the various stages of this history and an inspiration to looking towards the future. I hope that you will make songs and make art and make videos, and please make TikTok videos, because I'm probably not going to do that, and we need some people to do that, because this, we need to meet people where they are with this movement, and they are on TikTok, y'all. So anyway, you are the new fat activism. All of the people who carved the path for us to be here today were trying to make a better world for themselves and for us. I am so glad that you made it here today to learn a bit more about some of them. And I look forward to future opportunities to engage with you more about the learning I'm doing about some of the ones whose names are not as recognizable as Steve Post and Bill Fabry and Lou Lauterbach and the Fat Underground. And the Fat Underground had a sort of flowing membership, so it's hard to just list all the names of people who were involved in that. But I think there's so much more for us to learn, so much more for us to continue learning together. And I thank you for your time today, and I encourage you to stay in touch. I am Eye of the Tigress on most things. IOFTHETIGRESS, Eye of the Tigress, on most of the things that exist. On LinkedIn, I am under my legal name, Tigress Osborn, and on PayPal, I am under Full Figure Entertainment, which again was the name of the nightclub that I used to run. And I encourage you to reach out, to get in touch, to make suggestions, to tell me stories you know about fat history that I don't know, and to tell me things that you would like to learn that neither of us learned, so maybe we can learn them together. Thank you, Crystal, for the opportunity to be part of this conference, and thank you all for giving me this half an hour of your time. Take care, everyone. See you next time.